My mother-in-law looked at my newborn son and said, "He's not really part of this family because he doesn't have our race." The fluorescent hospital lights made everything look washed out and unreal, but I heard every word with perfect clarity. My wife Claire was still in the recovery room after an emergency C-section, and I'd been holding our son Noah for exactly 43 minutes when my mother-in-law Judith walked into the maternity ward with my father-in-law Roger, trailing behind her. I'd expected tears of joy or excited cooing over her first grandchild. Instead, Judith looked at Noah's beautiful brown skin against the white hospital blanket, and her face went tight in a way I'd seen before, but had always convinced myself I was imagining. She didn't reach out to hold him. She didn't ask his name or weight, or any of the normal grandmother questions. She just stared at him like he was a problem she needed to solve, and then those words came out of her mouth in the same tone she might use to discuss a disappointing restaurant meal. Roger shifted uncomfortably beside her but said nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd agreed with her outright. I stood there holding my 6-pound, 4-ounce son, feeling my arm shake not from his weight, but from the sudden understanding that everything I'd been telling myself for the past 3 years was a lie. I'd been dating Claire for 6 months before I met her parents, and that should have been my first clue that something was off. Claire was close with her family, talked to her mother daily, spent every holiday at their house in Connecticut, but somehow the introduction kept getting delayed. She'd make excuses about her parents traveling or being busy with work or having other commitments, and I'd believed her because I wanted to believe her. When we finally did meet at a carefully orchestrated dinner at a neutral restaurant, Judith had been perfectly polite in that cold, controlled way that made every compliment feel like an insult wrapped in good manners. She'd asked about my job as a software engineer with just enough interest to seem engaged, commented on my education from a state university rather than an Ivy League school with a subtle tone that suggested she was filing the information away as a mark against me, and smiled when Claire talked about our relationship with a smile that never reached her eyes. Roger had been warmer, asking about my family and my interests, but I noticed he deferred to Judith on everything and went quiet whenever she gave him a certain look. Claire was white, blonde, from a wealthy family in Greenwich that could trace their lineage back to the Mayflower or whatever the hell old money families used to prove their worth. I'm black, from a middle-class family in New Jersey, first generation to go to college, and I'd worked my way through school while Claire's tuition had been paid from a trust fund established before she was born. None of that had mattered to us when we fell in love at a mutual friend's wedding, where we'd both been in the wedding party and ended up talking all night about books and music and our shared dream of traveling to Japan. But it clearly mattered to Judith, who started making comments almost immediately after that first dinner. Subtle things that Claire would dismiss as me being oversensitive or taking things the wrong way. When I'd gotten a promotion at work, Judith had said something about diversity initiatives helping everyone these days. When Claire and I got engaged after 2 years together, Judith had asked multiple times if we were sure we wanted to move so fast, if we'd thought about how our different backgrounds might create challenges, if we'd considered what our children might face growing up. Claire had assured her mother that we'd discussed everything and were committed to building a life together, and Judith had smiled that tight smile and said she just wanted us to be realistic about the difficulties ahead. The wedding had been tense beneath the surface perfection. Judith had insisted on paying for everything, which gave her control over every detail, and she'd made decisions that subtly excluded my family at every turn. The venue she chose was a country club that my parents had never heard of and clearly felt uncomfortable in, with staff who kept asking if they were sure they were in the right place. The menu featured food that catered exclusively to Judith's tastes, with no acknowledgement of my family's preferences or cultural background. When my mother had suggested including a jumping the broom ceremony as a nod to our heritage, Judith had said that might be too ethnic for some of the guests, and would we mind keeping things traditional? Claire had been caught between us, stressed and crying, and I'd backed down because I didn't want to ruin her day by fighting with her mother over symbolism. Looking back, that was the moment I should have seen clearly what was happening, but I'd convinced myself Judith just had different tastes and wasn't deliberately excluding my family. My mother had looked at me with knowing eyes when I'd explained the decision, and she'd said quietly that some battles needed to be fought early before they became wars, but I'd been 26 and in love, and certain I could manage the situation with patience and understanding. The comments continued after the wedding, always delivered in that same controlled tone that made it hard to call out directly. When Claire got pregnant after a year of marriage, Judith's first response had been to ask if we'd planned it or if it was an accident, as if she couldn't imagine we'd want to bring a child into our mixed-race marriage on purpose. When we announced we were having a boy and planned to name him Noah, Judith had suggested we might want to consider a more traditional family name from her side, like Robert or Charles or William, something that wouldn't stand out as much. Claire had firmly told her mother that Noah was the name we'd chosen, and it wasn't changing, and I'd felt a surge of love for my wife standing up to her mother for the first time I'd witnessed. But Judith had just smiled and said that was fine. We could do whatever we wanted, though she hoped we understood that names mattered and would follow a child throughout their life. The implication was clear, even if she never stated it outright, that Noah's name combined with his appearance would mark him as other, as different, as not quite belonging to Judith's world. Claire had started noticing the comments more during her pregnancy, when her mother's criticism shifted to include how we were preparing for the baby. Judith didn't like the diverse children's books we'd registered for, suggesting we might want more classic literature instead. She'd questioned our choice of pediatrician, a black woman with excellent credentials, asking if we'd considered someone with more experience at the hospital Judith preferred. When we'd decorated the nursery with artwork featuring children of all different races and backgrounds, Judith had commented that it was very politically correct, but wasn't that a lot of messaging for a baby who wouldn't even understand pictures yet? Each comment on its own seemed small enough to overlook, but they added up to a pattern I was finally starting to recognize. Claire had confronted her mother twice during the pregnancy, telling her that her comments were hurtful and needed to stop, and Judith had acted shocked and wounded, claiming she was just trying to help and didn't understand why we were being so sensitive. Roger would step in during these confrontations to smooth things over, saying Judith just wanted the best for everyone, and maybe we were all a bit stressed with the pregnancy. Couldn't we just move forward and focus on the positive? Now here we were in the hospital room, and Judith had finally said out loud what she'd been implying for 3 years. Noah wasn't really part of the family because he didn't have their race. I looked down at my son's perfect face, his eyes closed in sleep, his tiny fingers curled against his chest, and felt something sharp and protective rise in my chest. I'd spent 3 years making excuses for this woman, convincing myself she just needed time to adjust, telling Claire I didn't want to cause family drama by making everything about race when maybe I was just being paranoid. But standing there holding my newborn son while his grandmother rejected him based on his skin color, I finally understood that I'd been gaslighting myself to keep the peace, and the peace I'd been keeping was built on the foundation of accepting that my son would never be enough for these people. Roger cleared his throat and said maybe they should come back later when Claire was feeling better, pulling Judith toward the door. She went with him, but turned back to say she hoped I understood she was just being honest about the situation, that it wasn't personal, but we all needed to be realistic about how the world worked. I told her to get out and not come back until she was ready to apologize, and my voice came out low and controlled in a way that surprised me. Judith's eyes widened slightly, and she looked at Roger as if expecting him to defend her, but for once, he just kept pulling her toward the door. They left, and I stood there alone with Noah, my hands shaking now from adrenaline and rage, and the dawning realization that I had to tell my wife what her mother had just said, and it would break her heart. Claire was wheeled back to a recovery room 20 minutes later, still groggy from the medication, but asking immediately to see the baby. I handed Noah to her and watched her face transform with love and exhaustion and pure joy as she held our son for the first time. She counted his fingers and toes, stroked his dark curls, told him how much she loved him and how long she'd waited to meet him. Then she looked up at me and asked if her parents had come by yet, and I had to figure out how to tell her what had just happened without destroying this perfect moment. I said they'd stop by briefly, but left because she was still in recovery, which was technically true, even if it left out the devastating part. Claire looked disappointed, but said they'd be back tomorrow, and she couldn't wait to see her mom hold Noah for the first time. My stomach twisted, knowing that might never happen, at least not in the way Claire was imagining. I waited until the next morning when Claire was more alert and Noah was being checked by the pediatrician to tell her what her mother had said. We were alone in the recovery room with weak February sunlight coming through the window, and I sat on the edge of her bed and explained exactly what had happened. I repeated Judith's words verbatim because I knew if I paraphrased or softened them, Claire might think I was exaggerating. I watched my wife's face go through stages of disbelief, confusion, and finally a kind of horrified understanding as she processed what I was telling her. She started crying and said that couldn't be right. Her mother wouldn't say something like that. Maybe I'd misunderstood or taken it out of context. I told her there was no other context to take those words in, and Claire got quiet in a way that scared me more than if she'd gotten angry. She said she needed to call her mother and find out what actually happened, and I felt a cold weight settle in my chest at the realization that Claire was already looking for ways to explain it away rather than accepting what her mother had done. Judith answered on the second ring, and Claire put her on speaker so I could hear. Claire's voice was shaking when she asked her mother what she'd said to me in the maternity ward yesterday. There was a long pause before Judith responded in that same controlled tone, saying she'd simply expressed some concerns about the challenges Noah might face being biracial, and that she'd been trying to prepare us for reality. Claire said that wasn't what I'd told her, and what exactly had her mother said about Noah not being part of the family. Judith sighed like she was being terribly misunderstood and said she'd mentioned that Noah wouldn't have the same heritage as Roger's side of the family, which was just a fact, and she was sorry if that had been taken the wrong way, but she'd only been trying to be honest. I jumped in to say that wasn't what she'd said. She'd specifically stated Noah wasn't really part of the family because he didn't have their race, and there was no misinterpreting those words. Judith's voice went cold when she responded to me, saying I seemed determined to create conflict where none existed, and maybe I was projecting my own insecurities onto innocent comments. Claire told her mother to stop talking to me like that, and Judith switched tactics immediately, her voice breaking as she said she couldn't believe her own daughter was attacking her when she'd just been trying to help, and this was so hurtful after everything she'd done for us. The conversation devolved into Judith crying and Roger getting on the phone to say we were all upset and emotional and should probably take some time to cool down before discussing this further. Claire hung up, looking devastated and confused, caught between what I was telling her and what her mother was claiming. I could see her struggling with the cognitive dissonance of believing either that her mother was a racist who'd rejected her grandson, or that her husband was lying or exaggerating about what had been said. She asked me if I was absolutely certain about what I'd heard, and I felt something crack inside me at the question. I told her yes, I was completely certain, and I understood she was in a hard position, but I needed her to believe me. Claire started crying harder and said she did believe me, but she also knew her mother, and this didn't make sense with the person she'd thought her mother was. I realized in that moment that Claire had been as good at ignoring the red flags as I had been, maybe even better because Judith was her mother, and accepting the truth meant accepting she'd been raised by someone capable of this kind of cruelty. We spent the next 2 days in the hospital barely talking about anything except Noah's feeding schedule and my recovery details, both of us avoiding the elephant in the room. Judith and Roger didn't visit again, and Claire didn't call them, and I could feel the unresolved tension building between us like a storm waiting to break. My parents came to meet Noah on the second day, and my mother held him with tears running down her face, while my father stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, both of them looking at their grandson with pure love and acceptance. My mother looked at me and said quietly that Noah was perfect and beautiful and completely belonged to our family, and I knew she was saying what she wished Claire's mother had said. My father asked how we were doing in that careful way that meant he knew something was wrong but wasn't going to push. I told them about what Judith had said and watched my mother's face harden with an anger I rarely saw from her. She said she'd known this was coming from the moment we'd announced the engagement, that she'd seen how Judith treated me at the wedding and during family gatherings, and she'd hoped I was wrong about what it meant, but deep down she'd known. My father asked what we were planning to do about the situation, and I said I honestly didn't know because Claire was still processing and I didn't want to push her when she'd just given birth. My mother said gently that this wasn't something that could be processed away, that Claire needed to choose whether she was going to protect her son or protect her mother's feelings, and there wasn't a middle ground where everyone got to be comfortable. I felt the weight of that truth settle over me. My parents stayed for a few more hours, helping with practical things and filling the room with warmth and normalcy, and when they left, I felt the absence of that support even more acutely. Claire had been quiet while they were there, and after they left, she told me she'd been thinking about what my mother had said about Noah belonging to our family. She said she knew her mother's comment had been wrong and hurtful, but maybe we could work through it with some family counseling, help Judith understand why her words had been so damaging. I looked at my wife and felt a distance opening between us that scared me more than anything else that had happened. We came home from the hospital on a Friday afternoon to a house that felt different than when we'd left it. The nursery we'd prepared with so much love and excitement now felt like a sad reminder of the family unity we'd thought we were building. Claire's phone had been buzzing constantly with texts from Judith, asking how we were doing, saying she missed us, suggesting we all needed to sit down and clear up this misunderstanding. Claire showed me the messages, and I could see how carefully Judith was wording everything, positioning herself as the victim of miscommunication rather than the perpetrator of racism. There was nothing explicitly apologetic in any of the texts, just vague references to unfortunate words and different interpretations and the importance of family moving past disagreements. I told Claire that her mother was manipulating the narrative and we shouldn't engage until Judith was willing to acknowledge what she'd actually said and apologize sincerely. Claire agreed, but I could see the pull Judith had on her, the lifelong conditioning to smooth things over and maintain family harmony. The first week home with Noah was a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. We were both exhausted and emotionally raw, not the best state to be navigating a family crisis. Claire's sister Diane called on day 5, and I could hear her voice through the phone asking Claire what the hell was going on, because their mother was devastated and saying we wouldn't let her see her grandson. Claire tried to explain what had happened, but I could hear Diane interrupting, saying Mom's version sounded very different, and maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Claire's voice got sharper when she said there hadn't been a misunderstanding. Their mother had said something terrible about Noah, and Diane needed to stop defending her. Diane said she wasn't defending anyone, but she also knew how their mother was, and sometimes she said things that came out wrong, and couldn't Claire give her a chance to apologize properly. Claire asked if Diane had talked to me about what actually happened, and Diane admitted she'd only heard Judith's side, but she was sure we could all work this out like adults. The conversation ended badly with Claire hanging up and crying into my shoulder about how her whole family was choosing her mother's feelings over our son's dignity. I went back to work after 2 weeks of paternity leave, and Claire was home alone with Noah during the days. She started texting me updates about her mother's increasingly aggressive attempts to contact her. Judith was calling multiple times a day, showing up at the house when she knew I'd be at work, leaving gifts on the porch with notes saying she couldn't wait to meet her grandson properly. Claire was holding firm on not seeing her mother until there was a real apology, but I could feel her resolve weakening under the constant pressure. Judith had a lifetime of experience manipulating Claire's emotions, and I was watching it happen in real time. 3 weeks after Noah's birth, Claire told me her mother had sent a long email that almost sounded like an apology, and maybe we should at least read it together. I said okay, and we sat on the couch that evening with Noah sleeping in his bassinet beside us, while Claire opened the email on her phone. The email was a masterpiece of manipulation, disguised as contrition. Judith wrote that she'd been reflecting on our conversation in the hospital and realized her words had caused hurt, which had never been her intention. She explained that she'd only been trying to express legitimate concerns about the challenges biracial children faced in society, but she could see now that her delivery had been insensitive and poorly timed. She apologized if her comments had come across as rejecting Noah, because nothing could be further from the truth. She loved her grandson and wanted nothing more than to be part of his life. She wrote that family was the most important thing, and she hoped we could move past this difficult moment and focus on building memories together. The email ended with a request to come visit and finally hold her grandson, promising she would be more careful with her words in the future. Claire looked at me hopefully after we finished reading, asking if I thought we should give her mother a chance. I read through the email again, parsing every word, and felt my anger build at what I was seeing. I pointed out that Judith had never actually acknowledged what she'd said, never used the words race or racist, never took full responsibility for the harm she'd caused. The entire email was structured to make it sound like the problem was our interpretation rather than her actual words and beliefs. Claire's face fell as she reread the email with this new perspective, and she could see what I was pointing out. She asked what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted a real apology that specifically acknowledged what had been said and why it was wrong, followed by concrete evidence that Judith had actually examined her beliefs and was committed to change. Claire said that seemed like a lot to ask, and maybe we should take what we could get and move forward with clear boundaries. I felt my chest tighten at the suggestion that we should accept less than full accountability for the sake of family harmony. I told Claire as calmly as I could that this wasn't just about hurt feelings or a misunderstanding. This was about our son growing up knowing he was fully loved and accepted by his entire family, and I wouldn't compromise on that. Claire said she understood, but also didn't want Noah to grow up without knowing his grandmother, and weren't we being a bit harsh by expecting perfection from someone who was trying? I realized we were having fundamentally different conversations. Claire was approaching this as a family conflict that needed resolution, while I was approaching it as a threat to our son that needed to be eliminated. We decided to see a family therapist, someone who could help us navigate the situation with professional guidance. Dr. Amelia Foster was a black woman in her 50s who specialized in interracial family dynamics and had excellent reviews online. We met with her the following week, leaving Noah with my mother for the afternoon. Dr. Foster listened to both of us explain what had happened, reading through the text messages and email Judith had sent. When we finished, she looked at Claire and asked gently how much of her mother's behavior over the years had followed this same pattern, saying hurtful things and then repositioning herself as the victim when called out. Claire was quiet for a long moment before admitting that her mother had always been this way, that growing up, she'd learned to just ignore the comments that bothered her because confronting Judith always led to tears and accusations, and ultimately Claire feeling guilty for upsetting her mother. Dr. Foster nodded and explained that what Claire was describing was a classic pattern of emotional manipulation, and the current situation with Noah was unlikely to be an isolated incident, but rather an escalation of existing behavior. Dr. Foster asked me how Judith had treated me over the course of my relationship with Claire, and I laid out the 3 years of microaggressions and subtle racism I'd been experiencing. Hearing it all out loud in one sitting made the pattern undeniable even to Claire, who kept interjecting with, "I didn't realize," and "I should have seen that," as I described incident after incident. Dr. Foster said that racism in families often presented this way, with plausible deniability built into every comment, so that victims could be accused of being oversensitive if they objected. She told us that Judith's comment about Noah not being part of the family was what happened when the careful mask slipped, when the underlying belief that had been there all along came out in an unguarded moment. She asked Claire directly if she believed her mother held racist views, and I watched my wife struggle with the question before finally admitting that yes, based on everything we'd discussed, it seemed like her mother did hold those views, whether she consciously acknowledged them or not. The session with Dr. Foster gave us language and framework for what we were dealing with, but it also made the problem feel bigger and more intractable. We couldn't therapy our way out of Judith's racism, and we couldn't force her to change beliefs she'd held for her entire life. Dr. Foster recommended that we set firm boundaries with clear consequences, that we not allow Judith access to Noah until she'd done significant work to address her biases, and that we prepare ourselves for the possibility that she might never do that work. She also recommended that Claire start seeing her individually to work through the complicated emotions of recognizing that her mother had hurt her family and would continue to hurt them if given the opportunity. We left the appointment feeling both validated and overwhelmed. Everything that had seemed manageable if we just found the right words was now revealed as a fundamental incompatibility between our values and Judith's worldview. Claire started individual therapy with Dr. Foster the following week, and I could see the work it was doing on her. She came home from each session looking exhausted and sometimes crying, working through years of normalized behavior she was now seeing clearly for the first time. She told me that Dr. Foster had helped her understand that her mother's manipulation tactics had been shaping her responses since childhood, and that learning to trust her own perceptions instead of automatically deferring to Judith's version of reality was going to take time. I supported her through the process while also watching carefully to make sure she wasn't backsliding into old patterns. Judith was relentless in her attempts to contact Claire, and I could see how much energy it took for my wife to maintain her boundaries. Roger called me directly for the first time in weeks, asking if we could talk man-to-man about the situation. I agreed to meet him for coffee, curious what he wanted to say without Judith there to control the narrative. Roger looked older than I remembered when we met at a cafe halfway between our homes. He ordered coffee and sat across from me with his hands wrapped around the cup, like he was trying to draw warmth from it. He said he knew things had gotten bad with Judith, and he wanted me to know he didn't agree with what she'd said about Noah. I asked him why he hadn't said anything in the hospital when she'd made the comment, and Roger looked uncomfortable before admitting he'd learned a long time ago that contradicting Judith in the moment only made things worse, but he'd talked to her about it privately afterward. I asked what he'd said to her, and Roger described a conversation that sounded more like gentle suggestions to be more careful rather than a fundamental challenge to her beliefs. He said Judith was from a different generation and had different views, but she did love Noah in her own way and just needed time to adjust. I felt my frustration rising at this excuse I'd heard so many times before. I told Roger that being from a different generation didn't make racism acceptable, and that his refusal to stand up to his wife was enabling her to hurt his grandson. Roger's face tightened, and he said, I needed to understand how complicated long marriages were, how sometimes you had to pick your battles and maintain peace at home. I said his peace at home was coming at the cost of his grandson's well-being, and that wasn't an acceptable trade-off. Roger asked what I wanted from them, what it would take for us to move forward as a family. I laid it out clearly, a genuine apology that acknowledged the racist nature of Judith's comment, evidence of real work to examine and change her beliefs, and consistent respectful treatment of Noah going forward. Roger sighed and said that seemed like a lot to ask, and couldn't we just agree to move on and do better going forward without dragging everything through the mud? I told him no, we couldn't, because moving on without accountability was just teaching Noah that his existence was something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Roger left the coffee shop looking defeated, and I knew he was going to go home and report back to Judith that I was being unreasonable and wouldn't compromise. I didn't care. I'd spent 3 years compromising my own dignity, and I wasn't going to compromise my son's. Claire's sister Diane showed up at our house 2 days later without calling first. She arrived mid-afternoon when Claire was home alone with Noah, and I got a frantic call from my wife saying Diane was there and wanted to talk about the situation. I left work early and drove home to find Diane sitting in our living room with Claire looking tense and Noah asleep in his bouncer. Diane stood up when I walked in and said we all needed to have an honest conversation about what was happening with Judith. I said I was fine with honesty and sat down next to Claire. Diane launched into a speech about how our family was falling apart over a misunderstanding, how Judith was devastated and not sleeping or eating, how Roger was worried about her health, and how we needed to find a way to forgive and move forward. I let her finish before asking if she'd called what her mother said about Noah a misunderstanding because she genuinely didn't understand what was wrong with it, or because she was trying to minimize it. Diane got defensive and said she wasn't trying to minimize anything, but she also thought we were being unnecessarily harsh and unforgiving. I asked Diane directly if she thought it was acceptable for her mother to say that Noah wasn't really part of the family because of his race. Diane hesitated before saying that her mother obviously hadn't meant it that way, and we were taking her words out of context. I said there was no context that made those words acceptable, and asked Diane what context she thought would justify telling a father that his newborn son wasn't really part of the family. Diane got flustered and said that wasn't the point. The point was that family forgave each other and worked through difficult moments, and by holding this grudge, we were punishing everyone, including Noah, who deserved to know his grandmother. Claire spoke up for the first time and told her sister that Noah deserved a grandmother who wouldn't reject him for being biracial, and until Judith could guarantee that, she wasn't getting access to our son. Diane looked shocked at Claire's firm stance, clearly having expected her sister to be more malleable. She tried a different approach, saying that their mother had health issues and this stress was making everything worse, and could we please just let her come visit and hold Noah one time so she could stop worrying. I felt rage build in my chest at this emotional manipulation, using Judith's health as leverage to guilt us into exposing our son to someone who'd already shown she saw him as less than. I told Diane that her mother's health was not our responsibility, and using it to manipulate us into compliance was inappropriate. Diane's face flushed, and she said, I obviously didn't understand family loyalty or how things worked in their family, and maybe if I'd come from a different background, I'd be more forgiving. The words hung in the air for a moment before Claire exploded, telling her sister to get out of our house and not come back until she could treat her husband with respect. Diane tried to backtrack, saying she hadn't meant it like that, but Claire was already standing and pointing to the door. Diane left with tears in her eyes, and Claire collapsed onto the couch shaking with adrenaline and fury. She said she couldn't believe her own sister had just made a racist comment right in front of her, and I realized the apple didn't fall far from the tree in that family. The incident with Diane crystallized something for both of us. Claire called Dr. Foster that evening for an emergency session and came back 2 hours later looking exhausted, but resolved. She said she'd been holding on to hope that her family could change if we just gave them enough chances. But Dr. Foster had helped her see that we'd already given them chances, and they'd responded by doubling down on their harmful behavior. She said she was done protecting her mother and sister's feelings at the expense of our son and our marriage, and if they couldn't accept Noah as he was, they wouldn't be part of his life. I felt relief flood through me at hearing my wife fully committed to protecting our family, even if it meant severing ties with the people who'd raised her. We decided together that we would send one final communication to Judith and Roger, laying out exactly what we needed from them, and if they couldn't meet those requirements, we'd be going no contact. I drafted an email with Claire's input, being as clear and specific as possible about what had happened and what needed to happen next. We described exactly what Judith had said in the hospital, explained why it was racist and harmful, outlined our requirements for any future relationship, which included a genuine apology, meaningful education about racism and unconscious bias, and demonstrated change in behavior over time. We made it clear that these weren't negotiable demands or starting points for bargaining, but the minimum requirements for having access to our family. We stated that if they chose not to meet these requirements, we would respect that choice and move forward without them in our lives. Claire read and reread the email probably 20 times before finally agreeing to send it, and I watched her finger hover over the send button for a full minute before she pressed it. The email went out on a Wednesday evening, and we waited to see what response would come. Judith's response arrived less than an hour later, and it was everything I'd expected and feared. She wrote that she was shocked and devastated by our ultimatum, that she'd already apologized multiple times and didn't understand what more we wanted from her, that requiring her to undergo education and prove herself was degrading and punitive, and that she refused to be treated like a criminal for loving her family and expressing legitimate concerns. She said that if we were going to hold past comments against her forever, then maybe it was best if we did go our separate ways, because she couldn't live under the constant threat of being accused of racism for every word she spoke. She ended the email by saying she hoped we'd reconsider once we calmed down and realized how much Noah would lose by not having his grandmother in his life. Roger sent a separate, shorter email saying he was disappointed in both of us for forcing this choice and hoped we'd come to our senses before it was too late. Neither email acknowledged any wrongdoing or showed any understanding of why their behavior had been harmful. Claire read both emails with tears streaming down her face, and I held her while she cried for the family she'd thought she had and was now losing. She said she kept hoping they'd surprise her, that somewhere deep down her parents would choose their grandson over their pride, but clearly that wasn't going to happen. I told her I was sorry she was going through this, and I meant it. I'd lost something too in this process, the hope that I could be fully accepted into a family I'd tried so hard to belong to, but my loss was nothing compared to what Claire was experiencing. She'd grown up with these people, trusted them, built her identity around being their daughter, and now she was having to choose between them and her own child. The choice should have been easy and obvious, but that didn't make it less painful. We implemented no contact the next day, blocking Judith and Roger's phone numbers and email addresses, telling Diane through a brief message that we wouldn't be seeing her until she apologized for her comment, and removing ourselves from the family group chat and social media connections. It felt both decisive and terrifying, cutting ourselves off from Claire's entire family in one swift action. My parents were supportive but concerned, worried about how this would affect Claire long-term and whether we'd be able to maintain the boundaries we'd set. My mother said she admired what we were doing, but also warned that family had a way of wearing you down over time, and we needed to stay strong together. I promised her we would, and meant it. The first few weeks of no contact were weirdly peaceful. Without the constant barrage of calls and texts and manipulation attempts, we could focus on being new parents without the additional stress of managing Judith's feelings. Noah was thriving, growing and changing every day, and we were falling into a rhythm as a family of three. Claire had good days and bad days, sometimes feeling confident in our decision and sometimes grieving the loss of her family. Dr. Foster helped her work through the complicated emotions and supported her through the process of building a new identity separate from her role as Judith's daughter. I watched my wife become stronger and more confident in her own judgment, no longer second-guessing herself or looking for external validation of her choices. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks after we'd gone no contact, there was a knock at our door. I looked through the peephole and saw Judith and Roger standing on our porch with wrapped gifts in their hands. My heart started racing, and I called to Claire, who was in the nursery with Noah. She came out and looked through the peephole herself, her face going pale when she saw her parents. They knocked again, louder this time, and Judith called out that she knew we were home and they just wanted to see their grandson for a few minutes. Claire looked at me with panic in her eyes, asking what we should do. I said we should call the police if they didn't leave when we asked them to, because this was trespassing after we'd made our boundaries clear. Claire nodded and opened the door a crack with the chain still engaged. Judith's face lit up when she saw Claire, and she started talking fast about how much they'd missed us and how they'd brought gifts for Noah, and couldn't we please just let them come in for a few minutes. Roger stood behind her looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing to stop her. Claire told her mother they needed to leave because we'd been clear about our boundaries and they were violating them by showing up uninvited. Judith's expression shifted to hurt and confusion, saying she was Noah's grandmother and had a right to see him, and how could we be so cruel as to keep him from her? Claire's voice was shaking but firm when she said that right had been forfeited when Judith rejected Noah based on his race, And until she was willing to do the work we'd outlined in our email, she didn't get access to our family. Judith's mask slipped then, and her face twisted with anger as she said she'd already apologized and we were being ridiculous and vindictive, that she could take us to court for grandparents' rights if we were going to be unreasonable about this. The mention of legal action made something snap in me. I pulled out my phone and started recording, stating clearly for the camera that we'd asked them to leave our property and they were refusing. Judith saw the phone and her face went red as she demanded I stop recording her. I said I'd stop when she left our property, and until then, I was documenting everything for our protection. Roger finally spoke up, telling Judith they should go and they'd figure out another approach. Judith turned on him viciously, saying she was tired of his cowardice and she had every right to see her grandson. Roger looked miserable, but helped pull Judith away from our door, and they left the gifts on the porch before getting back in their car. I kept recording until they drove away, then immediately downloaded the video to multiple locations and sent a copy to our lawyer. Yes, we'd hired a lawyer after the email exchange made it clear Judith might pursue legal action. Attorney Monica Brennan specialized in family law and had experience with grandparents' rights cases. She'd reviewed everything we had documented, the hospital incident, the text messages, the emails, the recording of Judith threatening to take us to court, and she'd told us we had a strong case if it came to that. Connecticut had grandparents' rights laws, but they required proving that denying access would harm the child, and our documented evidence of racist comments and emotional manipulation would make that difficult for Judith to argue. Monica had advised us to keep documenting everything, maintain our boundaries consistently, and not engage with any contact attempts. We'd followed her advice to the letter, and now we had video evidence of Judith violating our clearly stated boundaries and making threats. Monica called me after reviewing the video and said this was exactly the kind of evidence that would help if Judith did file for grandparents' rights. She asked if we'd be willing to file for a restraining order based on the harassment and threats, and Claire and I discussed it that evening. A restraining order felt like an extreme step, legalizing the separation in a way that would make reconciliation nearly impossible. But we also recognized that Judith had shown no signs of respecting our boundaries and had explicitly threatened legal action. We decided to move forward with the restraining order, and Monica filed the paperwork on Monday morning. The temporary order was granted based on our documentation, and Judith and Roger were served with papers requiring them to stay at least 500 feet away from us and have no contact pending a court hearing. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and Monica prepared us for what to expect. We'd need to present our case for why the restraining order should be made permanent, showing a pattern of harassment and threatened harm. Judith would have the opportunity to defend herself and argue that she posed no threat to us or Noah. Monica said these cases could get ugly, that family members often said things in court they could never take back, and we needed to be prepared for that. Claire and I spent hours going through all our documentation with Monica, organizing everything chronologically and creating a clear narrative of escalating harassment. The hospital incident, the manipulative emails, Diane's visit and racist comment, the showing up at our house after being told not to, the threat of legal action, all of it painted a picture of a woman who would not respect boundaries and who posed a risk to our family's emotional well-being. The day of the hearing arrived and we walked into the courthouse with Monica, leaving Noah with my parents for the day. Judith and Roger were there with their own attorney, a man named Gerald Winters, who specialized in family law. Judith looked smaller somehow, older and more fragile than I remembered, and I felt a flicker of something like sympathy before remembering exactly why we were there. The hearing was held in a small courtroom with just the judge, the 2 legal teams, and us. Judge Rebecca Thornton was a black woman in her early 60s who'd been on the bench for 15 years, and I felt a small measure of relief that she'd understand the racial dynamics at play in our case. Monica presented our evidence systematically, walking through the timeline and showing the text messages, emails, and video recording. She quoted Judith's statement about Noah not being part of the family because of his race, and I watched the judge's expression harden. Judith's attorney tried to paint her actions as those of a concerned grandmother desperate to see her grandson, arguing that she'd made one unfortunate comment in a stressful moment that we'd blown out of proportion. He presented character witnesses, friends of Judith's, who testified that she wasn't racist and was a loving person who'd been unfairly cut off from her family. He argued that filing for a restraining order was an extreme overreaction designed to punish his client for having different views on race relations. Monica countered by pointing out that Judith had never actually apologized for the racist comment, had continued to harass us after being asked to stop, had threatened legal action, and had shown up at our home in violation of our stated boundaries. She emphasized that protecting a child from racist attitudes and emotional manipulation was not an overreaction, but responsible parenting. Judge Thornton asked Judith directly if she understood why her comment about Noah not being part of the family had been harmful, and I watched Judith struggle with the question. She said she'd been taken out of context and misunderstood, that she loved her grandson and just wanted the best for him, but she never actually acknowledged that the comment had been racist or wrong. The judge asked if Judith was willing to commit to the requirements we'd laid out in our email, the apology, education, and demonstrated change. Judith's attorney objected that the court couldn't compel his client to undergo education or therapy as a condition of seeing her grandchild, that these demands were unreasonable and punitive. Judge Thornton said she wasn't compelling anything. She was simply asking if Judith was willing to do what her daughter and son-in-law had requested. Judith said she didn't think she should have to prove she wasn't racist to people who should trust her, and that education programs about unconscious bias were basically brainwashing designed to make white people feel guilty. The words hung in the courtroom, and I saw Judge Thornton make a note on her legal pad. When Judith's attorney tried to walk back the comment, the judge held up her hand and said she'd heard enough. Judge Thornton granted the permanent restraining order, citing a pattern of harassment, refusal to respect boundaries, explicit threats of legal action, and most damningly, Judith's own testimony that revealed she had no understanding of why her comments had been harmful and no intention of changing her behavior. The order required Judith and Roger to stay 500 feet away from us and Noah and prohibited all contact, including through third parties. Judith started crying in the courtroom, and Roger put his arm around her while glaring at us like we'd done something wrong. Claire was crying too, but quietly, and I held her hand while the judge finished reading the terms of the order. We left the courthouse with the restraining order in place, and I felt both victorious and empty. We'd won the legal battle, but it had cost us Claire's entire family and any hope of reconciliation. Monica congratulated us and said we'd done the right thing, that children deserved protection from toxic family members, regardless of biological relationships. I thanked her for her work and paid her final bill, hoping we'd never need her services again, but knowing we probably would when Judith inevitably violated the restraining order. We didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks after the hearing, Judith created a Facebook post that went viral in her social circle. She wrote a long, tearful narrative about how she'd been cut off from her precious grandson by a vindictive son-in-law who'd turned her daughter against her, how she'd done nothing wrong except express normal grandmotherly concerns, and how the courts had failed her by granting a restraining order based on lies and manipulation. The post carefully avoided mentioning what she'd actually said about Noah, instead focusing on her pain and suffering and portraying herself as a victim of family cruelty. Comments flooded in from her friends offering support and condemning us for being heartless, and the post was shared hundreds of times. Claire saw it when one of her old college friends sent it to her asking if it was true, and I watched my wife's face as she read through the distorted version of our story that her mother was spreading. We consulted with Monica about whether the Facebook post violated the restraining order's provision against contact through third parties. She said it was a gray area since the post wasn't directed at us specifically, but it was clearly meant to harass and damage our reputation. She advised documenting everything and considering a defamation suit if Judith continued to spread false information. Claire decided to write her own Facebook post setting the record straight, something she'd been avoiding until now because she'd wanted to keep everything private. She wrote a careful statement, explaining that we'd made the difficult decision to establish boundaries with her parents after they'd made racist comments about our biracial son, that we'd given them multiple opportunities to acknowledge the harm and commit to change, and that when they'd refused and instead escalated to harassment and threats, we'd had no choice but to seek legal protection. She didn't quote what Judith had said exactly, trying to take the high road, but she was clear that the issue was racism and that she stood by her decision to protect her child. Claire's post got significantly more engagement than Judith's, with friends from various parts of her life commenting in support and sharing their own stories of having to cut off toxic family members. Several people who'd known Judith over the years privately messaged Claire saying they weren't surprised, that they'd always sensed Judith had problematic views, but hadn't wanted to say anything. A few of Judith's friends commented defending her and attacking Claire for airing family business publicly, but they were overwhelmingly outnumbered by supportive responses. The public nature of the conflict made it real in a new way, no longer something we could pretend might be resolved privately, but a permanent fracture that everyone knew about. Claire's phone blew up with messages from people she hadn't talked to in years, old friends and distant relatives weighing in on the situation. It was exhausting and emotional, but also validating to have our experience witnessed and believed by so many people. Diane sent Claire a message calling her a traitor for making their family drama public and saying she'd destroyed any chance of reconciliation. Claire responded briefly that she'd only posted her own truth after their mother had posted lies, and that if Diane wanted to support Judith's racism, that was her choice to make. Diane shot back that she wasn't supporting racism. She was supporting her mother who'd made a mistake and was being punished beyond all proportion to the offense. Claire asked her sister directly if she thought it was a mistake to say a biracial child wasn't part of the family because of his race, and Diane stopped responding. The silence from her sister hurt Claire deeply, the final confirmation that her entire family of origin was choosing Judith's version of reality over the truth of what had happened. Roger reached out through his attorney asking if we'd be willing to have a mediated conversation about the situation, suggesting that maybe Judith had been overwhelmed by everything and would be willing to apologize properly now that she'd had time to think. Monica was skeptical, but said we could explore mediation if we wanted to, that it might give us closure one way or another. Claire and I discussed it and agreed to one mediation session with clear parameters. We'd hear what Judith had to say, but we wouldn't compromise on our requirements or expose Noah to her until those requirements were met. The mediation was scheduled for 2 weeks later with a professional mediator named David Lawson, who specialized in family conflicts. We met at a neutral location, a conference room in an office building, with Monica present as our advocate. Judith looked terrible when she walked in, thinner and older than at the court hearing, and I felt that flicker of sympathy again. Roger looked exhausted, holding Judith's arm like he was the only thing keeping her upright. Their attorney, Gerald Winters, was there too, and David Lawson introduced himself and laid out the ground rules for the mediation. Each side would have time to speak without interruption. We'd focus on finding solutions rather than assigning blame, and everything said would be confidential unless we chose to use it in future legal proceedings. Judith went first, and I braced myself for what she'd say. She started crying almost immediately, talking about how much she missed Claire and how devastated she'd been by the restraining order and how she'd never meant to hurt anyone. She said the comment in the hospital had come out wrong, that she'd been trying to express concerns about how society would treat Noah, and it had been twisted into something hateful. She said she loved Noah and wanted to be part of his life, and would we please give her another chance to prove herself. Monica asked if Judith was willing to specifically acknowledge that her comment about Noah not being part of the family because of his race had been racist and harmful. Judith hesitated, then said she didn't think using the word racist was fair because she didn't have hatred in her heart for any race, but she understood that the words had been hurtful and she regretted them. Monica pressed further, asking if Judith understood why those words were racist, regardless of what was in her heart, and Judith got defensive, saying she felt like she was being put on trial again. David Lawson intervened to redirect, asking what Judith was willing to do to rebuild trust with us. Judith said she'd be willing to apologize properly and be more careful with her words in the future, but she didn't think she should have to go through education programs because she wasn't ignorant or hateful. Claire spoke up for the first time and said that was exactly the problem, that her mother didn't see why education was necessary, which meant she hadn't actually understood what she'd done wrong. The mediation broke down from there, with Judith getting increasingly upset and accusing us of being unforgiving and cruel, and Claire and I holding firm on our requirements. Gerald Winters tried to negotiate, suggesting that maybe Judith could read some books about racial bias, and that would count as education. But Monica pointed out that passive reading wasn't the same as active engagement with trained professionals. Roger sat silently through most of it, occasionally trying to calm Judith down, but never actually advocating for understanding our perspective. After 2 hours of going in circles, David Lawson called the session and said it was clear we weren't going to reach an agreement today. He suggested we all take time to think about what we'd heard and whether there was any path forward. We left the mediation with nothing resolved, and I felt the door close on any remaining hope of reconciliation. Months passed, and Noah grew from a newborn into an infant with personality and preferences and the beginning of awareness. He smiled and laughed and started reaching for things, and every milestone felt both joyful and sad because it was another thing Judith was missing through her own choices. My parents were involved grandparents, visiting weekly and video calling between visits, building a relationship with Noah that was full of love and acceptance. Claire's parents sent gifts on his 3-month birthday and 6-month birthday, packages that arrived without notes or acknowledgement of the boundaries they were violating. We donated the gifts and documented the violations, adding them to the file Monica kept in case we needed to enforce the restraining order more strictly. Diane got married during this time and didn't invite Claire to the wedding, a clear message about where family loyalties lay. Claire cried when she found out through a mutual friend's social media post, mourning the sister relationship that had been another casualty of Judith's racism. We found our rhythm as a family of 3, building new traditions and creating our own definition of family that wasn't based on biology or obligation, but on genuine love and respect. We surrounded Noah with people who celebrated all of who he was, introducing him to my extended family and to friends of all different backgrounds and races. We talked about how we'd eventually explain to him why he didn't know his maternal grandparents, how we'd help him understand that their limitations weren't his fault or his burden to carry. Dr. Foster continued working with Claire on processing the loss and building her identity separate from her family of origin, and I watched my wife become more confident and at peace with the decisions we'd made. On Noah's first birthday, we threw a party with my parents, my siblings, our close friends, and some of Claire's friends who'd stood by us. The celebration was full of joy and love, and only briefly did I see Claire's face fall when she looked at the grandparents section and saw only my parents there. Judith made one final attempt to connect when Noah turned 1, sending a letter through an attorney that technically didn't violate the restraining order's direct contact prohibition. The letter was addressed to Claire and expressed regret for how things had turned out, asked for a fresh start, and included photos of Claire as a baby with her grandparents. The emotional manipulation was transparent, using Claire's relationship with her own grandparents to guilt her into giving Judith access to Noah, but it still affected her. She cried reading the letter and looking at the photos, remembering her grandparents who'd loved her unconditionally, and wondering if Noah would ever have that from her side of the family. I held her and reminded her that Noah had unconditional love from my parents, and that quality mattered more than quantity when it came to grandparents. Claire agreed, but still grieved what should have been, the family that could have existed if Judith had chosen love over pride. We didn't respond to the letter, maintaining the boundaries we'd set. Monica filed the letter as documentation of another attempt to contact us, in violation of the restraining order's spirit, if not its letter. 2 months after Noah's first birthday, Judith and Roger announced they were moving to Florida to be closer to Diane and her husband, who'd relocated there for work. The move felt like a final closing of the door, a physical distance that matched the emotional distance already in place. Claire's feelings about it were complicated, relief that there'd be less chance of random encounters mixed with sadness that her mother was choosing to move closer to Diane rather than doing what it would take to rebuild a relationship with us. I felt mostly relief, grateful that we wouldn't have to worry about Judith showing up at playgrounds or grocery stores or anywhere else we might normally encounter family. Noah is 3 years old now, and he's never met his maternal grandparents. He knows he has grandma and grandpa who are my parents, and he's too young to understand that most kids have 2 sets of grandparents. We'll explain it to him when he's older, in age-appropriate ways that help him understand that some people's thinking is limited by prejudice, and that's about them, not about him. We've built a beautiful life with people who love and accept all of us, and Noah is growing up confident and secure in who he is. Claire has healed in many ways from the loss of her family of origin, though she still has moments of grief, especially around holidays or major milestones. She's built chosen family with friends who've been more supportive than her biological relatives ever were, and she tells me regularly that choosing our son over her mother was the easiest and hardest decision she's ever made. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.